Author of several books on topics such as surveillance, the state of surveillance, the surveillance state, the role of intelligence elite in the whole mess, and her recent book titled Intelligence Elites and Public Accountability has just came out on Routledge and is way too expensive for you to buy. Thank you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you for a lovely introduction.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Sorry, yeah. Right, I have to multitask. Great. So, yeah. Is that okay? You can hear with that? Great. So, yes, this is me. This is the topic. I was asked to really to think about a key question that this festival wanted to pose, which is how to recognise totalitarianism at a time when corporations know more about citizens than states do. So my aim with this, hopefully brief talk, is really just to discuss mass surveillance, as revealed by whistleblower Edward Snowden several years ago. I will talk a little bit about some academic concepts, but very briefly, because we haven't really got time. I'll point you to literature if you're interested in it, but really what I want to do is to highlight what an intimate portrait of your life that mass surveillance can paint, and I also want to talk about the democratic problems that this raises. So ultimately, I'm going to be arguing that we need to increase our capacity as citizens to hold surveillance power to account. That is really my main message. So, how can we recognise totalitarianism at a time when corporations know more about citizens than the states do? So, you know, since this was the key question I was asked to consider, the first thing I did, as any sensible human being would do, was I Googled totalitarianism. And this was the first thing that came up. And it's useful to remind ourselves of the definition, I think. This is the top of Google search. A system of government that is centralised and dictatorial and requires complete subservience to the state. I thought, okay, that may not sound like too many governments that we live under. But then when I looked at the second definition on Google, because like any good human being, I don't just take the first result that comes from the search engine, but at least triangulate it with the second. The second definition on Google was actually a Wikipedia definition. It was a little bit more expansive. So totalitarianism is a mode of government which prohibits opposition parties, which restricts individual opposition to the state and its claims, and exercises an extremely high degree of control over the public and private life. And it gives the example of mass surveillance as being a feature of a totalitarian state. So I thought, right, now we're cooking. Now we can actually get into something that I know about, which is mass surveillance. So I'm going to discuss today digital mass surveillance with you, as revealed by Snowden. And again, as I say, to highlight the intimate portrait that this can paint of your life. I mean, what can we know about ourselves through digital mass surveillance? What can be known? Well, according to this guy, who you will recognise, I hope. In 2013, this guy, Edward Snowden, was a National Security Agency contractor, so the NSA in America is the big signals agency, intelligence agency. He turned whistleblower, and he basically exposed the extent of intelligence agencies' mass surveillance policies, not just in America, but also in Britain, and a large number of other liberal democracies. So basically, these mass surveillance policies, they collect information on ordinary citizens, not on criminals, on ordinary citizens in these countries. And they collect data in mass, or in bulk, as the intelligence agencies put it. And they collect it from your digital communications, basically. And then they store this data for some time. They select this data, they analyse it. The aim of this bulk mass collection is to provide a haystack, if you like, from which the needle of suspicious activity, be it terrorism, be it whatever, can be found. So all this data provides a background of normalcy against which suspicious activity, suspicious signals, unusual activity can actually be stand out and detected. So Snowden revealed two sources of bulk data collection. he revealed, first of all, that the intelligence agencies collect all this data from the servers of American internet, computer, and social media companies. And they do it through this. This is an NSA slide, by the way, one of the many NSA slides that Snowden leaked. And this one is actually about a collection program called PRISM, stands for Planning Tool for Resource Integration, Synchronization, and Management. So the NSA has run this particular program since 2007, and it's with the willing participation of all of these companies, right? All the big American social media telecoms companies, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, Facebook, Paltalk, YouTube, Skype, AOL, Apple, right? So since 2007, this has been going on. As Snowden revealed, it wasn't necessarily with their consent, by the way. There's implications that perhaps companies were coerced or forced into this arrangement with the intelligence agencies. Not all of them, of course. But it's an interesting one. You know, if you're a big American company, you might actually be preferred to be compelled to cooperate with the intelligence agency, because that actually removes a certain level of ethical decisions from you as a company about should you be surveying your users, your customers, or not. Anyway, so this is one of the sources of data that the intelligence agencies can tap. And then the other source is a program which the NSA calls Upstream. Upstream is where the NSA seizes communications from the company's own private fibre optic undersea cables and switches and routers that carry internet traffic. So these are the two main programs in place since, for over a decade. What do they collect? I mean, basically, they collect two types of things. They collect the content of communications. So this is your email, your instant messages, the search term that you put in Google, so they'll know I've been searching for totalitarianism, but also your full web browsing history as well. And they also collect the metadata, which metadata is data about data. So, things like when did the communication happen, between whom, where was it sent, how long was the content, the contact, all this sort of stuff. So they collect both of those things. And you could ask the question, so what, maybe, does this matter? I mean, I would argue it does matter because it's actually quite intimate data when you think about how all these data sets can be combined and then what sort of picture they can actually paint of your life. There's just so much of the data, so much of it. If you start combining all these different data sets together, the picture of your life that it will build is almost complete, I think. It will, obviously tell people what you buy, where you shop, where you go. It will also tell people what your thoughts are, what you're searching for on Google, what are you reading, if you're reading online material, as increasingly we all do. We're really getting into the privacy of thought here. And just focusing on one of these databases conveys the richness, I think, of this data, and hence how very privacy invasive it can be. So this is, which one is this? This one is an NSA, an NSA program called Dishfire. It's actually the third line down. So these slides are horrible, by the way. These are NSA slides, right? If I produced a slide, it would not look like this. This is very aesthetically unattractive. But this is NSA training slides, and this is what has been leaked. So this is what I'm showing you. So this is their Dishfire database. So this is basically collects text messages. And it also stores, if anyone with a smartphone knows, it also stores your geolocation data. It will gather your names if you have electronic business cards. It will look at your financial transactions as well, which it will do by linking your credit cards to the phone user. And it will look at border crossings as well, because every time I cross from the UK to Slovenia, I'm told I've crossed a border. There are roaming alerts, there are missed call alerts. All of these things get collected by this one program, Dishfire, and that's one set of data streams about people. But you've got to bear in mind, of course, that the diversity of data collected is absolutely huge and ever increasing. The talk after me by Professor Andrew McStay is going to be actually on a new data stream that will soon become prevalent, which is data about your emotions, which is largely done by biometrics and wearables. But, there's already tons of data out there that they're collecting. And it's not just current data, it's past data as well. So according to the leaked documents, in America, the data that they collect through the PRISM program is actually stored for 5 years. So that's 5 years worth of all of this data streams that the intelligence agencies can use to look back on, to cross-refer and to check stuff. And the intelligence agencies are very upfront about this ever since the leaks came out. They said, hey guys, yeah, we are doing a lot of surveillance, but it's really good for society. It keeps you very secure. I mean, this sort of data stream is invaluable for us as intelligence agencies because we can discover new threats, and we can discover these threats before they actually happen. So we can preempt those threats. We can keep everyone safe. And don't you want to be safe? Surely everyone wants to be safe from terrorists, right? So the intelligence agencies are very adamant that this sort of data is brilliant for them. It helps them do their job of keeping society safe. Of course, there might be other side effects as well. And certainly critical theorists and sociologists have talked about this, big data analytics, and what sort of happens when disparate, massive data sets are linked and exploited, often in real time, to derive insights and meaning. You know, it's not always a socially unproblematic thing to do. Commercial organisations do it on scale to sell you stuff. Intelligence agencies do it to preempt specific threats and to catch criminals. So this is what's going on, right? Basically, what we have here, we mustn't never forget that it is intimate data, right? We mustn't forget that. And what we really have here is an interesting social arrangement, I think. You have the state intelligence agencies, very reliant on the commercial communications platforms to extract this data. In another paper, which I won't go into, I actually call this scenario the Veyant panoptic assemblage. Don't really know if I have time to go into that, to be honest. No, he doesn't care. Basically, what the Veyant panoptic assemblage very quickly describes is a very dystopian arrangement of mutual watching, where the surveillant assemblage is all the commercial data which the surveillant platforms collect. So when the surveillant assemblage and the panopticon, which is the state surveillance apparatus, they basically play off each other. They mutually inform each other. The assemblage produces a stock of data, a stock of analysable material that the panopticon, or the state, can reappropriate. We saw this situation with Snowden's leaks. It's not just a panoptic assemblage, it's not just the state and the corporations. I've also got the term veyance in there because I've actually taken that from an engineering professor in Toronto called Steve Mann, who's an interesting guy. This is a picture by Steve Mann's 6-year-old daughter, where produced some years ago. He basically looks at mutual watching, surveillance, and what he calls surveillance. Surveillance is actually citizens watching back. So surveillance is watching from above. Think about the French, sur, above, watching from above, watching from a position of power, like the state watches us, like commercial organisations watch us. That's surveillance. But he says maybe there's a scope for surveillance, where citizens can watch back. Citizens in relative positions of powerless might be able to watch the watchers. Surveillance, watching from below. So he talks about this a lot. He also talks about veyance. So he gets rid of the sur and the su, and he says, right, let's just talk about veyance. Veyance is processes of mutual watching or monitoring. And he says maybe we could actually reach a state of equiveyance, equality between those watching from above, those watching from below. And if we managed to reach that state, that would be a totally transparent society, in his view, and that would be very interesting. Anyway, so that's Steve Mann. So I just take the word veyance from his theorisation and put it on with panoptic assemblage, because I think there might be some ways of resisting, of watching back. We can't really avoid being watched from above. It's everywhere. The commercial organisations are doing it. The state is doing it. But is there something we can do to watch back, to watch the watchers, to maybe tip the balance a bit more in our favour, if you want to put it in those terms, and to maybe hold them to account a little bit more? Because I do think it's very important to hold to account people who are doing the watching. If we can't avoid the watching, can we at least make sure that the people who are watching are doing so carefully, within the bounds of legality and ethics and morality, and aren't necessarily invading our privacy. Can we ensure that? And if so, what would we need to do to make that happen? To basically prevent a drift to totalitarianism. Because if we don't do that, that's where we're going, I would argue, right? So it's a very important call to action, I would suggest. Okay, if anyone wants these PowerPoint slides, I can send them to you, because there's lots of good hyperlinks where I argue about this elsewhere. So I do argue in various places that we do need to increase the capacity of people to hold surveillance power to account. So in the remaining 5 minutes or whatever we have, I'll maybe just briefly allude to one or two of those things that I think we need to hold surveillance power to account. So one of the things I think we need are very robust oversight mechanisms of the watchers, of the state watchers, of the intelligence agencies. And these oversight mechanisms should happen already in various parts of society. In your parliament, there should be ways of holding the intelligence agencies to account. In your judiciary, there should be ways of doing so. In your press, there should be ways of doing so. The press should also be asking critical questions on all of these issues. But the problem that I found in my research, and my research has looked mostly at America and Britain, is that these oversight mechanisms, in reality, are actually very weak. They exist, but they're very weak. They're very secretive, and often what you find is the people who are meant to be doing the oversight end up being co-opted or, at worst, uninformed. So this is problematic, right? I mean, yes, obviously state intelligence agencies are secretive, but someone needs to be holding them to account and be doing it properly. As for commercial surveillance organisations, these are very opaque creatures. These are very hard to hold to account. Even legislatures find it very hard. I mean, you've only got to look at Facebook and the US Senate to see how hard it was for the US Senate to extract any meaningful information from Facebook in its recent inquiry into Russian disinformation and its influence on the American election. So, very, very problematic with that. The other problem with oversight mechanisms is one country might actually hold its own intelligence agents to account quite well, but what about all the other countries? So you've got to remember that all the countries are connected with intelligence sharing relationships, and these are really secretive. We really don't know the quid pro quo. We do, as citizens, we do not know what the basis is for these intelligence sharing agreements. But for instance, Snowden tells us there are 43 eyes. We have the Five Eyes, which is America, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, and Australia. They have a very close and long-standing intelligence sharing relationship. But we also have the 43 eyes. And I put this up because it actually includes Slovenia. Interesting. So I don't know if you know this, but you're part of a global intelligence sharing network. And yes, Slovenia itself does have mechanisms of oversight, but have you ever heard of these? Have you? Oh, good. If you have heard, that's good, because most British audiences haven't heard of the British version. But how do they work, you know? And do they do robust jobs? Your Commission for the Supervision of Intelligence and Security Services, your Court of Audit, your Human Rights Ombudsman, your Information Commissioner. Do these bodies hold your intelligence agencies to account in a way that you as citizens would be aware of and understand? Privacy International, which is an NGO, did a really interesting study earlier this year where they looked at intelligence oversight in 40 countries around the world, including Slovenia. And they actually found that most countries around the world lack the domestic legislation on intelligence sharing. There just isn't any legislation there. Instead, there's very broad and vague powers which the intelligence agencies used for this sort of international cooperation. Maybe that's fine, maybe you don't care, but you know, we have in the past had things like secret rendition and torture, not in the very distant past, you know, that America started. And we certainly know that Eastern Europe was part of that network. So, you know, and maybe it's fine because it prevents terrorism, but does it? Where's the actual info? It's very hard to get that actual info from these organisations. Anyway, so that's one thing I suggest we need to do. Still okay on time? Oh, yeah. Perfect. We'll get there. Another thing I think we need to do to increase the oversight, the surveillance of the surveillance organisations is it would be nice if we could actually move away from this collect-it-all mentality of the commercial platforms. You know, I mean, Google wants all your data. So does Facebook. They want to collect it all because obviously they can extract monetary value from that. There is a commercial imperative there. for ever more refined and targeted insights into consumers. And that's problematic, I think. I don't think it's going to be easy to move away from that mentality. Intelligence agencies also want to collect it all. One of the leaked slides that Snowden gave us 5 years ago was this one, which is one of the leaked NSA slides, I think, about the US intelligence agency's new collection posture. And as you'll see, it says, look, what we want to do, we want to know it all, collect it all, process it all, exploit it all, partner it all, sniff it all. They want to know everything, basically. They want total information awareness, as was referred to in yesterday's opening performance. So, it's real. They do want to know all this, and they've got the tools in place because obviously they're piggybacking on the commercial platforms to make this happen. So I think challenging this one is going to be challenging the collect-it-all mentality is going to be very difficult. And it's problematic, I think, because with this sort of mentality comes chilling effects. If you know you're being mass surveyed, are you going to be as free and as open in your expression of opinion, especially online, as if you weren't being mass surveyed? The chilling effects of mass surveillance on citizens and on journalists, actually, have already been documented. So academics and others have already looked at page views of Wikipedia articles on terrorism. This has gone down as a result of knowing that you are being surveyed, for instance. Chilling effects have been demonstrated in usage of Facebook as well. There's a great study by Stoichev on that. People don't use Facebook in the same way if they know people are surveying them. There's been a decline in privacy-sensitive terms in Google that might get the users into trouble with the US government. So people aren't searching for stuff on Google if they think, oh yeah, the US government may not like this. These are largely American studies, by the way. Americans are unwilling to discuss the Snowden leaks or the NSA on social media compared to face-to-face settings. So all of these things. And then writers are self-censoring as well. A Penn study found that American writers are much more self-censored post-Snowden than pre. And another survey of American journalists found up that 14% of them gave up on a story or a source because they're worried about being surveyed by their government. This is a 2015 study. So there's lots of examples out there that actually chilling effects are real, and people really, they do change their behaviour when they think they're being surveyed. And, that's problematic, basically. So my final point, we need to try and commit to prevent these chilling effects. How we commit to that, I don't know. I'd love to open this up to the audience to find out what you think. But another thing that maybe we could do is commit to prevent the drift to tyranny and to prevent the drift to totalitarianism. So this is Privacy International's research. They've done some brilliant research over the last 2 decades where they have been looking at the sale of mass surveillance architecture to authoritarian governments. So all these things get developed in liberal democracies like America and Britain, but then they get sold to not so nice places like Dubai and other places, right? Big Brother Incorporated is well worth looking at. Privacy International's publication from 20 years ago. It was the first ever study of the increasing role of the arms industry and the international trade in surveillance tech. But their more recent report is really scary as well, the global surveillance industry. Because what that shows is it's a very comprehensive analysis of the industry's products and customers. I don't know if you can read that, but what this graphic shows is the equipment which is used to monitor internet communications on a nationwide scale. It's the malware that's also used that internet service providers can use, for instance, to turn on your mobile phone camera without you knowing it and to survey you. There's mobile phone monitoring technology up there. This could trick hundreds of mobiles to connecting to it. It could be used to identify everyone at a protest, for instance. There are real sort of real-world implications of these things. So Privacy International do warn, and I think this is true, it's now technically possible to monitor. We can monitor entire groups, entire nations on a mass scale. We can do it systematically and relatively cheaply. It poses a fundamental threat to individuals, security, civil society, human rights, as well as to democracy itself. So I think really we have to end on that. The drift to totalitarianism what is to be done. It's not easy, right? But it's never easy, right? But we do need to increase civil society's capacity, I think, to hold surveillant power to account. Those are the three things I've talked about. Some might be easier than others. But yeah, that's it from me.
Thank you, Vian. I'm going to start with a slightly right-wing provocation, and then we see where that leads us, and eventually open up the floor for questions. So you talk about surveillance, surveillance, unequal types of viewing, and how we need to bring special attention to our political process, both as it happens, you know, on the front and behind the scenes. But I would like to nudge the whole theme a little bit in another direction and talk about transparency. That is, this is an idea I get from the work of the Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han. That is, if we look at how the political process works nowadays, we see it is heavily mediatized. We have, you know, daily viewing of, let's say, decision-making processes inside Parliament, and the British Parliament is here an excellent example of how this works. And I'd say, and I'd ask you what your thoughts are on this question, that there is a certain overt amount of transparency when it comes to the daily going-ons of the political process that is somehow integrated in this same process, in these same processes of control. In the sense, okay, we have, I don't know, moral panics. We have, you know, daily hysteria reactions to the going-ons, and this eventually, obviously, at the same time, both influences the political process itself, because it ultimately falls prey to the game of representations it needs to play. While on another level, if we look, for example, you know, the most famous example of all, which is Donald Trump, you know, this is a sort of shameless politics that I think is at least on a certain level, much more based on a level of vulgar transparency in that sense than on a level of secrecy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest problem, and maybe it's the oldest trick in the communicative book as well, is actually misdirection. You know, so yes, we can be transparent, and yes, governments can show you the inner workings of X, Y, and Z. It's never going to be X, Y, and Z that is particularly meaningful, though. Yes, they might point you to a problem, this social problem, yes, and we're doing this about it, and I think this about it. Trump is a great example. And we can know in intimate detail what he thinks about certain things on Twitter. But is it the real stuff? You know, is it problems that we should be thinking about? Or is it problems that if we actually put our attention to might actually generate real-world change for lots of people for the benefit? Invariably, it's not. Invariably, it's what I would call misdirection. It still might be true stuff. Yes, he might be pointing the finger at a real social problem or issue. Probably not in Trump's case, actually. But, you know, other politicians do this. But is it the fundamental issue that we perhaps should be concerned with in society? I think we have a huge amount of transparency, but I also think it is used to misdirect people away from much more problematic issues, much more socially intractable issues that politicians don't want to talk about. So transparency, yeah, I mean, we only have a certain level of transparency. There's a huge amount of secrecy that goes on top of it. But governments can say, look, we're being very transparent. We've opened up Parliament, or we've opened up this set of archives, or we've given you this inside information on intelligence even. Pretty much every time they do that, it's in order to nudge the population a certain way to support certain policy outcomes that the government would prefer. The Iraq War is a great example of that in Britain, where in fact there was some intelligence. This is an unusual situation because back in 2002 or 2, just before the Iraq War happened, the British government took an unprecedented step of publicising some intelligence documents. Turned out, in retrospect, after the war had happened, that the intelligence documents were highly sexed up, highly irregular, were presented as much more certain than the intelligence agencies themselves had led the government to believe about whether or not Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and posed a threat to the West. So, you know, some intelligence was leaked. It was kind of true, but it was distorted. It was used to misdirect the British public from whether or not we should go into war or not. And, you know, we went into war. And only afterwards was it found that actually those intelligence documents shouldn't have been put out there because it was a very small part of the picture. We were being misdirected. You know, they didn't tell you all the rest of the contextual information that would make any sensible citizen go, hang on a sec, I'm not going to go to war on the basis of that intelligence document because it's that much of the picture and we need the full spectrum. The full spectrum showed that we shouldn't have gone to war. So, but this is a classic misdirection. You know, it's used by Labour governments, by Tory governments, right-wing, left-wing. It's used to further their policy preferences rather than inform the citizens so that citizens can reach a rational decision about the ways forward for society. And that is a problem, isn't it? Because as citizens, we get disenfranchised then. We get used to being manipulated and prodded and nudged. And we get less used to actually thinking about things deeply enough and seeing those deep thoughts with rational conclusions get fed into any sort of political process. And that is deeply problematic for us. And I think you're right that transparency does play a problematic role there. But it's not total transparency, is it? It's the partial transparency that the ruling elite, if you want for want of a better word, think it's appropriate for the people to be party to, is my view.
Okay, so you already touched upon an interesting topic here. So the idea that all this sort of data gathering, data collection is not primarily in the purpose of just this sort of simple analytics where you would establish a certain state of affairs, but is also, you know, a prerequisite, a tool maybe to influence the same state of affairs. And obviously here we come again to the topic of elections. The recent Bolsonaro election was, I don't know who mentioned this before, maybe it was you, was apparently also influenced by this same sort of Cambridge Analytica style approach. So I guess this would be a question of principle, so to speak, in the sense of, okay, so, you know, the whole thing is now out of the Pandora's box. So we have tools, we have developed tools that can, with a certain degree of accuracy, with measured accuracy, influence the behavior of voters, consumers, and so on. So do you think that, like, on a very general level, the right approach towards these kind of tools would be to impose certain general restrictions, limitations, or maybe perhaps let's call it universalization maybe of these methods. I mean, in some ways I'm asking whether we should, you know, open the whole field up for everyone to compete in, or you know, set up a very strict limit to these practices.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated question to answer because there are so many parties involved and so many stakeholders involved that actually could do something about fake news, about disinformation online, about all this, you know, from the Information Commissioner's Office, which you have, through to electoral commission regulators. So you will have a regulator that regulates how elections are done, what we do in the UK anyway, through to politicians themselves. Do they have a responsibility not to be deceptive online, and would they actually fulfill their responsibility, or you know, clearly not. Citizens as well have a responsibility, don't they, to not just share and press resend without reading something properly and thinking, should I really be resharing this just because it's got a funny headline, or because it's been sent by my friend who I trust, or, you know, without reading. So, you know, the circulation of disinformation is very, we all have a part to play in that. Educational institutions have a part to play. I mean, should we be educating our children now, and our pensioners, anyone who's not in the system of education? Should we be educating everybody about what could happen, what is happening, and the role of actually citizens in sharing in bad information, misinformation, disinformation? Should we be regulating the social media platforms, Facebook and Google? And if so, how do we then balance that regulation with free speech, you know, and political speech is protected. It's a protected human right. Everyone should be allowed to say what their political preference is online, and they are allowed. So how do we deal with that? And if we are going to go for regulation and censorship, which is I think what you're getting at, do we do it forever? do we just do it for a specific period, like just before the election? One day before the election, do we turn social media off? Would that be enough? Or do we need for 6 weeks before the election, do we need to regulate very closely what people are allowed to say, especially if they're political parties funded by Russian money, for instance, as has happened in Britain? Or, you know, what about big issues that, you know, connect people to a party and to vote? Because they are big issues, you know, like environmentalism or social justice or poverty. Big social issues. How would you regulate that? And would 6 weeks be enough? Because probably, if you're already attracted, say, to a far-right party and the issue of immigration, this probably hasn't been a result of the last 6 weeks. It's a result of the last 6 years, you know? So these are very, very tricky things. I think you're asking me, what would you do about it? I think you need to have every single stakeholder who has a way of influencing all of these things. You need to have them brought in to the conversation, and you need to say to them, how do we fix this and how do we work together? So I honestly think that you need everybody to pull together in the same direction if there's going to be any chance at all of saving social media from the levels of influence that we have seen and the level of disinformation and downright lies that we've seen. If we were all better citizens, the lies wouldn't sway us, though, would they? We would be able to see the lies, to recognise them, and to know that it doesn't match social reality, if we were better citizens. So there's also an onus on us as well, I think. And not just you yourself, but actually to tell your friends and your family, and actually ask them, what do you believe when you look online? Who are you following? Who are you recirculating? And do you have any idea about the credibility of that information source? And honestly, if every single individual did that, as well as all the other things I just mentioned, I think we might have a chance at saving social media. But it's a really difficult problem. I don't think there's a magic bullet at all on this.
Okay, I have a last quick question here before I open up the floor for other questions. The topic of disinformation we have now touched. It reminds me of, and I saw your testimony in front of some parliamentary commission.
Fake news.
Yeah, fake news thing.
I had very bad flu that day. So.
Oh no, but it was fairly interesting for me because it resonated with a lot of ideas I had about the phenomena. But one of the things that sort of relates to what you just said right now is the idea that, you know, when you have a campaign of disinformation regarding a specific topic on the internet, or, for example, you know, attacking a certain political actor, a certain institution, and so on, that in a lot of the cases, you know, the facticity of the accusations themselves aren't necessarily the most important thing about the accusation. So in the mind of the accuser, in a lot of the cases, the decision of guilt, so to speak, of choosing an enemy has been made much before any sort of facticity is being checked and so on. For example, I mean, it's hard for me to believe, and as far as I understand, this is not so, that, you know, people who read extreme or, let's say, populist right-wing media really believe every single shit that's written there, but it serves some sort of other function, which you talked also in that testimony.
Yeah. What's your question, sorry?
No, I just wanted you to continue a little bit.
Well, it's true. I mean, there's a lot of research on misinformation and why it circulates. I mean, before all this interest in populism and the right wing, there's been a lot of research on climate change and climate change deniers. You know, I mean, clearly 99.999% of the science shows that climate change is happening and that it's made by humans. But there's 0.0001% of scientists who say the otherwise. And then there's a lot of people who believe the 0.001% of scientists who say the climate change isn't happening or not caused by people. And this sort of misinformation is spread massively, especially online. Why it happens, yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of research that shows that people will believe what they already believe, right? So if you already believe that there's doubt over mankind causing climate change, you are going to be very predisposed to believe the 0.001% of scientists who also say that, and you're going to be doubly more prepared to disbelieve climate change is happening if a major think tank funded by the coal company then propagates the anti-climate change message online in a very attractive, well-packaged way. You know, and if that's what you see and that's what you're exposed to, yeah, that's the truth, you know. And then if the scientist comes along, the sane one, and says, yeah, actually, climate change is happening, you're just not going to believe them. They have no credibility with you, even though they're a scientist, even though they're an expert. So this is a problem. This is a real problem. It's a social phenomenon observed by those who study misinformation, which is basically that people tend to believe what they already believe. It's very, very hard to change someone's belief once they've actually made that belief. If you can get to someone before they've made a decision, before they've decided, yes, I believe this or that, you're in a much better position. So it's not a total bad news situation. There is scope for experts to come in and tell people the truth and for them to believe that truth, but only before that person has already made up their mind. So it's a funny situation, really, but it's one I think that political and professional communicators and academics and experts